Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Right, so let's jump right in. Today we're going to be looking at Lyndon B. Johnson and his impact on the civil rights movement. We all know about the big legislation, those landmark laws. But today we're really going to dig deeper and go beyond just the textbook version of this story. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're going to be uncovering, how Johnson's presidency was shaped by public opinion and the limitations of what the federal government could actually do.
Right.
And, of course, the rise of all these new forms of activism. It's going to be a fascinating story, so buckle up.
Yeah, I think what's important to remember here is that the fight for civil rights wasn't just about changing laws on the books.
Right.
It was about changing these deeply ingrained attitudes and these social structures that had been around for centuries.
It's like changing the whole culture.
Yeah, and for Johnson, that meant a whole new set of challenges.
So Johnson, he was the driving force behind these huge pieces of legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Correct.
Yeah, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was obviously massive victories against that, Southern segregation.
Huge.
But then things get a little bit more complicated, right?
Yeah, that's where it gets kind of tricky for Johnson. While these laws were critical in dismantling legal segregation, specifically in the South, they didn't just magically erase racial inequality in America overnight.
Of course not.
Johnson quickly realized that changing the laws didn't necessarily change the reality for Black Americans living in the North,
Right.
where segregation wasn't officially written into the law, but it was still deeply ingrained in everyday life.
It's just how things were.
Exactly.
So are you saying that even though these laws were a big step forward, they didn't really address the underlying root of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about centuries of systemic racism that had created this huge gap between Black and white Americans when it came to opportunities and just overall outcomes.
Right, like a huge gap.
Exactly, and that's what Johnson really struggled with, especially when it came to economic inequality. That's something that's so hard to tackle just through legislation alone.
Absolutely, and to make things even more complex, the civil rights movement itself was evolving during this time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It wasn't just one unified movement anymore.
Right. It had become so many different things.
Exactly. You had all these different groups using all these different approaches.
Right.
And that had a huge impact on how things played out.
So on the one hand, you had the nonviolent approach of people like Martin Luther King Jr.,
Right.
which, garnered this widespread support.
Huge support, yeah.
And it really helped create the political climate for those landmark laws we talked about.
Right.
But then on the other hand, you had the rise of the Black Power movement
Right.
with this much more militant stance,
Yeah.
which kind of introduced a whole new dynamic into the mix.
Absolutely, a whole new dynamic.
But wasn't the Black Power movement also fighting for civil rights, though? I mean, how could that complicate things for Johnson?
It really comes down to public perception. I think the nonviolent civil rights movement, they had won over a lot of white Americans. They really got people on board.
They seem to appeal to a broader audience.
Exactly. They were really successful in that way. But the Black Power movement, with this focus on self-defense and a more confrontational approach, it scared some white Americans.
So it felt like the rules of the game were changing all of a sudden.
Kinda, yeah. It's okay, ending Jim Crow in the South, that's one thing. But when the fight for equality starts coming to these northern cities,
Right.
well, suddenly people got really nervous.
They're like, wait a minute, this is getting a little too close to home now.
Exactly. And this shift in public opinion really started to hurt Johnson's agenda. Big time.
How so?
Well, get this. By 1966, a whopping 90% of Americans opposed any new civil rights legislation.
Wow, 90%. That's a huge drop in support.
It's massive, right?
What happened? What caused that?
Well, I think a big part of it was this fear that integration was going to change their own neighborhoods and schools, ending segregation as this abstract concept.
Yeah.
That was one thing.
Yeah.
But when it felt like it was going to impact their daily lives, well, a lot of white Americans pushed back.
You got scared, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. So you've got Johnson kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? You've got this increasing white resistance in the North and a growing Black Power movement challenging the status quo.
So what did he do?
Well, this is where Johnson makes a really bold move.
Okay.
He decides to throw his weight behind affirmative action.
Now, for our listeners who might not be totally familiar with affirmative action, can you just quickly explain what it is and why it was such a gamble for Johnson?
Sure. So affirmative action It was and still is actually a really controversial policy that was designed to address the historical disadvantages that marginalized groups face,
Okay.
particularly Black Americans. And the basic idea was to give these groups preferential treatment in areas like education and employment to try to level the playing field.
So it wasn't just about saying, okay, discrimination is illegal now. It was more about recognizing that centuries of systemic racism had created these huge inequalities.
Exactly. You can't just erase that by snapping your fingers.
And you needed to actually take proactive steps to try to make up for it.
Yeah. Johnson knew that this was going to ruffle some feathers,
Okay.
especially among those who saw it as reverse discrimination.
I can see why that would be controversial.
Oh, yeah. But Johnson, he felt it was essential if you really wanted to achieve true equality.
It was like a totally new way of thinking about civil rights.
It was a huge departure from the traditional approach, right?
Absolutely.
Like you said, it wasn't just about outlawing discrimination anymore. It was about acknowledging that just wasn't enough. You had to actually take proactive steps to fix the damage that had been done by centuries of injustice.
Right, and that's where Johnson's legacy gets really interesting and complicated.
Oh, yeah.
Was he a visionary leader pushing for truly meaningful change?
Right?
Or was he just a shrewd politician, playing the game and making calculated moves in a really volatile political climate?
It's a great question.
And that's the debate we're going to be diving into next.
So, we've been talking about these different ways that historians have viewed LBJ's role in all of this.
Right, like, was he really this driving force or what?
Yeah, and, the source we're looking at actually lays out some really fascinating different perspectives.
Okay, all ears hit me with him.
All right, so first up, you've got these progressive historians,
Okay.
and they tend to see Johnson as a real civil rights hero.
Like the champion of the movement?
Yeah, like a president who really used all his political power and savvy to achieve these huge reforms,
So they focus on the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act as like the main evidence of his commitment?
Exactly. Those were absolutely landmark achievements. And, for these progressive historians, they demonstrate Johnson's unwavering, dedication to dismantling segregation
Okay.
and advancing civil rights, even when it meant facing this intense opposition.
Which he totally did. I mean,
Yeah.
he knew he was going to lose some support by doing all this.
Oh, he absolutely did.
So I'm guessing they also point to his support for affirmative action as further proof of his commitment to tackling these deep-seated racial inequalities.
Totally. They see that as a really bold and necessary step to address those systemic barriers
Yeah.
that continued to hold back Black Americans even after legal segregation was outlawed.
Right, so it wasn't just about words, it was about action.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing not everyone sees LBJ as this perfect civil rights hero, right?
Oh, definitely not. You've got these other historians, these revisionist historians, who take a much more critical approach.
Okay, what do they say?
So they argue that Johnson, while undoubtedly skilled and effective,
Yeah, he was a great politician, for sure.
oh, yeah, he knew how to get things done, but these historians, they think he might have been more motivated by political strategy than by purely moral conviction. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's interesting. So they're suggesting that maybe he was playing the political game, using civil rights as a way to consolidate his power or achieve other goals.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, they point to things like his occasional use of racist language.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and, his willingness to compromise on certain civil rights issues when it was politically expedient,
So for them, it's not so black and white.
Exactly. Johnson's legacy for these historians is much more complex.
More nuanced.
Yeah, it's a mix of this genuine commitment to racial justice, but also this shrewd political maneuvering.
So we've got the heroes and the pragmatists, so to speak.
Right.
What other perspectives are out there?
Okay, so this is where it gets really fascinating.
Okay.
You've got this group of social historians, and they shift the focus away from Johnson himself,
Okay.
and they put it squarely on the grassroots activism
Oh,
that
interesting.
was happening at the same time,
So instead of seeing Johnson as this like leader who's pushing everyone forward,
Yeah.
they see him more as responding to the pressure that's already being created by the civil rights movement.
Exactly. They emphasize the courage and the organizing power of all these Black activists in both the South and the North. And they argued that it was their efforts that were the real engine of change.
That makes sense. I mean, rarely is it just one person who makes history happen, right?
Exactly. It's usually this convergence of different factors and movements that all come together to create real lasting change.
And it's important to recognize everyone who played a part.
Absolutely. And then, just to add another layer to all of this, you've got these Cold War historians.
Okay, now we're going global.
They bring this whole global perspective into the mix.
I'm intrigued. How does the Cold War play into Johnson's civil rights record?
Well, think about it. During this time, you've got the U.S. and the Soviet Union locked in this intense ideological battle, right?
The war, yeah.
And the Soviets were constantly using America's racial problems as propaganda.
Oh, yeah, like trying to make them look bad.
Exactly, highlighting this hypocrisy of American democracy,
So basically, America's racial inequality was making them look really bad on the world stage.
Exactly, undermining their claims of being this, beacon of freedom and equality.
It totally contradicted their message.
It did, and Cold War historians, they argue that Johnson, being the savvy politician that he was,
Right.
he understood this dynamic perfectly.
He knew how it looked to the rest of the world.
He did, and they say that he knew that passing civil rights legislation wouldn't just address this moral imperative at home,
Right.
but it would also help to bolster America's image abroad and counter that Soviet propaganda.
So it was like a win-win for him.
Yeah, in a way. So you see, even Johnson's motivations for supporting civil rights, they become more complicated when you consider this global context.
Yeah, it wasn't just about domestic politics anymore. It was about America's standing in the world.
Exactly, and that's what makes studying this period so fascinating. You've got all these different historical forces all overlapping,
Right.
domestic politics, the Cold War, the evolution of the civil rights movement itself.
Oh, it's a lot to keep track of.
It really is, and all of these forces shaped Johnson's actions and his ultimate legacy.
It's like you need a scorecard to keep track of all the different factors.
It can definitely feel that way, but that's history for you, right?
Yeah?
It's rarely simple or straightforward.
Never.
And when you're dealing with a figure as complex as LBJ, it's crucial to consider the full range of perspectives.
So after hearing all these different interpretations, where does that leave us? How do we even begin to assess Johnson's overall impact on this civil rights movement? Was he a hero, a pragmatist, just someone reacting to events, or something else entirely?
Well, that, my friend, is the million-dollar question.
A question for the ages.
It is, and it's one that historians are still debating to this day.
I bet.
But I think there are some key takeaways from Johnson's story that we can all learn from no matter what our perspective is,
Okay. I'm definitely interested to hear what those are. Let's dive into those takeaways and see what insights we can get from all of this. Okay, so we've talked a lot about LBJ, his role in the civil rights movement and all the different ways historians interpret his actions. But what's the takeaway here? Like, how should we be thinking about his legacy?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that you just can't categorize Johnson as, a hero or a villain. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, he was a real person.
Exactly. And his story, it's a powerful reminder that, even in moments of tremendous social change, the path forward, it's rarely clear cut.
It's messy.
It is. There are going to be victories and setbacks, compromises, bold moves, and a lot of times these unintended consequences that just kind of ripple through history.
So you're saying we should resist the urge to oversimplify things?
Totally, especially when we're talking about someone who was, operating at the highest levels of power during such a turbulent time in American history.
Yeah, he did make some tough calls.
He did. And we need to grapple with the full picture. The good, the bad, everything in between.
The whole enchilada.
Exactly. And with Johnson, there's a lot to grapple with. You can't deny the significance of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Those were landmark achievements that completely reshaped America.
Absolutely. They changed everything.
They did. And Johnson deserves a lot of credit for making those happen. He didn't have to expend all that political capital,
Right, especially knowing it would probably cost him support in the South.
Exactly. But he did it anyway.
Yeah.
He used all of his political savvy, his understanding of how Congress worked, and just his sheer force of personality to get those bills passed.
Yeah, he was a force to be reckoned with.
He was. He understood that ending legal segregation was a moral imperative, and he was willing to fight for it, even when it was politically risky.
But at the same time, we can't just ignore the fact that, Johnson wasn't this perfect champion of civil rights.
Of course not. He had his limitations, he made compromises, and sometimes he even used, racially charged language himself.
Right. He was a product of his time.
Exactly. Like a lot of white Americans, even those who supported civil rights, he struggled to fully grasp just how deep systemic racism really was.
And how much it impacted Black Americans.
Right. And those struggles were reflected in his policies and his actions.
And then there's that crazy statistic about public opinion turning so dramatically against further civil rights legislation by 1966. I mean, that really shows you the limits of what Johnson or any president could actually accomplish, even with the best intentions.
Yeah, that's a really sobering reminder that progress isn't always linear. You can have these incredible breakthroughs like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, wins.
Huge wins, and then suddenly things change and you're facing all these new challenges and setbacks.
And now, so maybe hero's too simplistic a label for Johnson, but did he at least fundamentally change the way America thought about civil rights?
I think that's a great question. By championing affirmative action, Johnson really moved the conversation beyond just ending discrimination.
It's about more than that.
He acknowledged that centuries of systemic racism had created this level of inequality that you couldn't just erase by outlawing discrimination.
Right. It was going to take more than that.
Way more. You had to take these proactive steps to actually level the playing field.
So it wasn't just about equality under the law. It was about trying to create genuine equality of opportunity.
Exactly. And whether you agree with the policy of affirmative action or not, it's hard to deny that Johnson's embrace of it represented a major shift in how the government approached racial justice. He really pushed the conversation forward.
And it's a conversation that's still happening today, right?
Oh, absolutely. Affirmative action is still one of the most hotly debated issues in America.
It is.
But it's a debate that wouldn't even be happening if Johnson hadn't put it on the national agenda back in the 60s.
That's a good point.
And that's part of what makes studying figures like LBJ so fascinating, Their actions have these ripple effects that go way beyond their lifetimes.
They change the course of history.
They do. They shape the political and social landscape for generations to come. And they force us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our past and grapple with these complex questions about how we create a more just and equitable society.
Big questions.
They are. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want listeners to take away from this exploration of LBJ and his, complicated legacy?
Yeah, what's the big takeaway?
I think the most important thing is to remember that history is never simple.
Yeah.
When we look back at figures like LBJ, we need to resist this temptation to put them in these neat little boxes.
Right.
They were complex human beings who made both significant contributions and, some really profound mistakes.
We're human.
They were. And it's in that messy, nuanced space that we can find the most valuable lessons and insights.
And maybe even more importantly, we can use those lessons and insights to inform our own actions and decisions.
Absolutely. As we continue to fight for a more just and equitable world, that's something we're thinking about.
It is on that note we've come to the end of our deep dive into the complex legacy of Lyndon B. Johnson. We hope this exploration has given you a new perspective on this really pivotal period in American history and encouraged you to think critically about how we assess the leaders and movements that have shaped our world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.